No explosion ever shook the station at Lublin. No rails were torn up. No train was stopped at gunpoint. No signal was sabotaged. And yet, within a matter of months, the eastern supply lines began to lose their precision. Not collapse, not fail outright, they drifted. Lublin was not an important city before the war. It was not a capital, not a hub of industry, not a place generals mentioned in their memoirs. It was a transit city, a place trains passed through on their way somewhere else. That was its function. That was its value. Before the occupation, mornings in Lublin followed a rhythm so regular that most people stopped noticing it. The sound of metal on metal announced the day before church bells or factory whistles. Trains arrived. Trains departed. Vendors timed their routines by the schedule pinned to the station wall. The clock above the main platform governed everything. When the city fell under occupation, that clock remained. The station building was not destroyed. The platforms were still swept. The benches were still there. To an outsider, nothing appeared different. But the meaning of time had changed. The most important trains no longer carried local passengers. They carried cargo that did not appear on public schedules. Crates sealed shut. Freight cars locked. Convoys listed only in internal documents. People learned not to ask. They lowered their eyes when military trains passed. They learned to wait without complaint. In Lublin, survival depended on blending into routine. At the far end of Platform 3 stood a small wooden booth. It was old, unremarkable, barely large enough for one man to stand inside comfortably. A stool, a heavy ledger, an ink pen, and a clear view of the station clock. Most passengers never noticed it. To them, it was part of the background. To the railway system, it was where time became official. Jan Kowalczyk stood there every morning. He arrived 10 minutes early, not out of diligence, but habit. Jan disliked being rushed. He believed that most mistakes came from urgency. He preferred margins. He hung his coat on the worn hook, opened the ledger, checked the pen, and looked up at the clock. Jan was not an important man. He wore no uniform of authority, no insignia. He gave no orders. Within the railway hierarchy, he was a low-level clerk whose job was simple: record arrival and departure times. His work did not move trains. It only described their movement. And because of that, no one paid attention to him. In an occupied city, invisibility was a form of protection. It was also a form of power that very few people realized they possessed. Jan had held this position for years before the war. Back then, the numbers he wrote were procedural. If he recorded an arrival a minute late, no one cared. If he made an error, he might be corrected, reminded, nothing more. But after the occupation, those numbers began to carry weight. Arrival times determined engine allocation. Departure times affected fuel distribution, track priority, and downstream scheduling across the region. Jan did not see those tables. He did not attend those meetings. But he understood enough to know that what he wrote did not disappear when the page was turned. Each morning he watched trains arrive. He listened for whistles. He noted the moment the last wheel cleared the platform. He wrote. No one questioned him. No one verified his clock. No one stood beside him to confirm. The system trusted him, not because he was trusted, but because the system was not designed to doubt men like him. For weeks after the occupation, Jan did nothing but survive. He kept his head down. He recorded times carefully. He avoided attention. Resistance was not a thought. Sabotage was not a plan. Like most people, he focused on getting through the day. But over time, something began to stand out. No one checked the times. Officers asked whether a train had departed, not whether it had departed at the exact recorded minute. They did not compare clocks. They did not reconcile entries between stations. As long as the ledger looked orderly, the system moved forward. In Lublin, where silence had become a survival skill, looking correct was often enough. Jan began to notice something else. Time was not as objective as the system assumed. A train did not arrive at the precise instant a wheel touched the platform. It arrived when the clerk decided it had arrived. It did not depart at the exact moment the engine moved. It departed when the clerk recorded it. There was a space there, a narrow one. Jan did not think of it as an opportunity. Not at first. For weeks he continued recording honestly. He did not want scrutiny. He did not want anyone to look at his ledger more closely than usual. But the realization did not go away. If he wrote 712, no one could prove it was not 713. If he wrote 725, no one could say it was not 724. The numbers had no witnesses, only acceptance. One morning, after recording the third train of the day, Jan looked back at the page. Clean lines, neat handwriting, everything appeared perfect. And he wondered, if everything looks perfect, who ever questions it? He did not imagine breaking the system. He imagined bending it, just enough that it would not quite align. A small deviation did not create chaos. It created adjustments. Another train waited. Another schedule shifted. Someone elsewhere compensated. Jan understood this not from theory, but from experience. Even before the war, weather delays or minor accidents had rippled outward. The system absorbed them, but not without strain. And under occupation, strain mattered. That morning, nothing changed. The city woke as usual. Trains ran. Officers moved along the platforms. Jan finished his shift and went home. But something had shifted in how he saw his work. The ledger was no longer neutral. It was a lever, small, quiet, almost invisible. And Jan Kowalczyk stood at the point where reality met paperwork, holding the pen that decided which version of reality would be preserved. The war did not change at that moment, but the conditions for something else had begun. The first deviation was so small that Jan almost forgot about it by the end of the day. It was a freight train arriving from the east just after sunrise. Heavy cars, military priority, nothing unusual. Jan watched it roll in, listened to the metal settle, glanced at the clock. The second hand crossed the mark. Jan hesitated, not because he intended to do anything, not because he was afraid, simply because for the first time he was aware that the moment was his to define. He wrote the time down. 1 minute later than it truly was. No dramatic pause followed. No officer turned. No whistle blew. The world did not react. The train departed. The ledger closed. John went on with his morning. If there had been consequences, they were invisible from Lublin. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. For days afterward, Jan returned to precision. He corrected himself mentally. He told himself the deviation had been accidental, insignificant, meaningless. But once you realize a system cannot distinguish between error and intention, you cannot unlearn it. The next deviation came a week later. Again, it was small. This time, an arrival recorded 30 seconds early. Well within plausible error, well within human variance. Jan did not choose trains at random. He did not target the same line twice in a row. He avoided patterns instinctively, though he would not have described it that way. He simply wrote what could not be disproven. And still, nothing happened. At least, nothing that could be seen. But systems do not respond instantly. They accumulate. A delay here meant an adjustment elsewhere. A minor inconsistency forced a dispatcher to compensate. That compensation created another small distortion further down the line. Jan did not see any of this. What he did notice was subtler. Conversations. A guard muttering that the morning schedule felt off. A station master checking his watch twice before waving a train through. A notice board amended in pencil, then erased, then amended again. These were not alarms. They were friction. The system was still functioning, but no longer effortlessly. And that was the point Jan had not yet articulated even to himself. He was not trying to stop trains. Stopping a train would be noticed, investigated, punished. He was trying to make the system work harder to achieve the same result. Every complex system assumes a certain level of reliability. It budgets for known problems, weather, wear, predictable delays. What it does not budget for is uncertainty that looks legitimate. Jan began to understand this in fragments. He noticed that trains which depended on tight connections suffered more from minor timing discrepancies. A 1-minute error mattered little to an isolated route, but it mattered a great deal to a train that fed into 3 others. He noticed that morning schedules were more sensitive than afternoon ones. The entire day stacked upon those early movements. Disturb them, and the rest had to adjust. He noticed that military convoys, despite their priority, were paradoxically fragile. Their schedules were dense, optimized, intolerant of ambiguity. Jan did not need a map to see this. He felt it. The station became tense on certain mornings, calm on others, and the difference often corresponded to which trains had been slightly misdescribed. Still, he was careful. Never the same deviation twice. Never the same magnitude. Never the same direction. One train recorded late, another early. One by a minute, another by 2. There was no logic anyone could extract. And because there was no visible logic, no one suspected intent. In offices far above Jan's position, reports began to conflict. Nothing alarming, just discrepancies. A train listed as having departed at one time in Lublin appeared to arrive elsewhere at a time that did not quite match. Not impossible, just inconvenient. Dispatchers assumed clerical error, or signal lag, or a mistake by someone else. The easiest explanation was always human error, just not Jan's, because Jan was invisible. He was consistent, quiet, unremarkable. He did not complain. He did not argue. He did not attract attention. The ledger remained neat, and neatness in bureaucratic systems is often mistaken for accuracy. Jan did not feel like a saboteur. That was perhaps the strangest part. He did not imagine himself resisting anything. He did not think in terms of ideology or victory. Those were words for people who acted openly. What he felt was closer to balance. The occupation imposed a rigid order on everything. Schedules, priorities, movements, nothing was allowed to drift. Jan introduced drift. Not enough to break the system, just enough that it could never quite settle. At home, life remained constrained. Food was scarce. News was filtered. Fear was constant. Jan did not talk about his work. There was nothing to say. His wife noticed only that he seemed more attentive, more quiet than usual. At night, Jan sometimes replayed the day in his head, not out of guilt, but calculation. Had anything been too obvious? Had he deviated too much, too often? He did not fear arrest so much as replacement. In an occupied system, you did not need to be accused to disappear. You only needed to be deemed unreliable. Jan resolved never to become noticeable. Weeks passed, then months. The deviations continued, but less frequently. Jan learned restraint. He learned that effectiveness came not from volume, but from timing. He intervened only when the system was under strain already. Bad weather, congestion, overlapping priorities. In those moments, even a small inconsistency amplified stress. The system reacted. Officers argued more often. Schedules were revised repeatedly. Local supervisors blamed distant ones. Distant supervisors blamed local conditions. Trust eroded, not dramatically, but persistently. And erosion, unlike collapse, rarely draws attention. Jan never saw a single train fail to arrive because of him. He never saw a derailment, never saw a breakdown he could point to and say, "That was mine." What he saw was fatigue. The people managing the system became cautious, less decisive, more reactive. They adjusted to yesterday's data, not realizing yesterday's data was already compromised by their own adjustments. The system began to chase itself. Jan realized then that he no longer needed to act as often. The deviations were reproducing. Once uncertainty entered, people responded to it. Their responses created new uncertainty. Jan could step back, and that was perhaps the most dangerous phase, because now the system's instability no longer depended entirely on him. He had become one source among many. One morning, as Jan stood behind the wooden counter, he noticed a young officer watching the platform clock longer than necessary. Not watching Jan, watching the clock. The officer frowned slightly, then checked his pocket watch. The two did not perfectly align. Jan felt something tighten in his chest. Nothing happened. The officer left. No questions were asked. But Jan understood. The system was beginning to notice not a culprit, but a sensation. That sensation was loss of precision. And systems built on control react badly to that feeling. Jan knew he was approaching a threshold, not because of what he had done, but because of what the system could no longer explain easily. From that day on, he slowed down. Not stopping, never stopping, just enough to let the system believe the disturbance might be resolving. He wrote perfectly accurate times for days at a stretch, letting trust rebuild, letting attention drift away. Jan understood something crucial now. Survival was not about action, it was about rhythm. You could not constantly push. You had to breathe with the system. Tension, release. Disturbance, calm. An invisible network required patience, and Jan was patient. Jan never thought of what he was doing as a network. That word suggested coordination, communication, intent shared across people. Jan had none of those. He did not meet anyone. He did not pass messages. He did not receive instructions. Every morning he stood alone behind the same wooden counter, opened the same ledger, checked the same clock, and wrote the same kind of numbers. And yet, the effects of his numbers began to intersect in places Jan would never see. Not in Lublin, but at distant junctions. Railway systems do not operate as isolated stations. Each line leans on another. A delay absorbed in one place is paid for elsewhere. A priority altered here reshapes priorities far away. Jan began to sense this when the reactions no longer stayed within a single day. A train subtly adjusted in the morning caused another to wait that evening. A small change recorded today appeared again as a correction tomorrow. The deviations did not disappear. They accumulated. And when enough of them accumulated, they began to resemble a pattern. Not Jan's pattern, but the system's struggle to correct itself. Jan could not see the whole picture, but he began to hear fragments of it. Other clerks complained that schedules were becoming harder to predict. Notice boards were erased and rewritten more often. Officers argued about which lines deserved priority, even though, on paper, everything still looked correct. No one talked about causes. No one questioned the accuracy of the original data. They trusted the system. And because they trusted it, they adjusted only the parts they could see. Jan understood then that the most dangerous disruption was not a large error. It was many small ones, originating from a place no one suspected. He changed how he worked. No more instinctive deviations. No more adjustments based on feel alone. Jan began to observe relationships between routes, between times, between reactions. He noticed that certain lines were more sensitive than others. Lines where a delay of only a few minutes forced multiple downstream decisions. Lines that connected regions, where an adjustment in one place demanded responses in many others. Jan did not need a full system map. He only needed to remember which trains made the station tense, and he chose those. Not all of them, not often. Just enough to keep the system slightly off balance. One day, a high-priority train arrived exactly on time, but was recorded as departing 4 minutes late. The next day, another was recorded as arriving 2 minutes early. No visible logic, no repetition. Jan understood that systems are excellent at solving problems, so long as the problems have familiar shapes. But when problems are unstable, the system must guess. And guessing is where human error enters. In administrative offices further up the chain, tables and reports began to misalign. Dispatchers could not be certain whether a train had truly arrived or whether it had merely been recorded as arriving. They did not doubt the data, They doubted each other. One coordinator believed another had miscalculated. One department suspected another of misapplying priority rules. Trust eroded quietly, without accusation. John did not learn this from reports. He learned it from fragments. A signalman complaining in passing. A track guard joking that trains now run by the ledger, not the clock. The comments were casual, almost humorous. To John, they were confirmation. He still did not know how far the effects extended. He did not know whether the delayed trains influenced larger strategic decisions. He did not know whether anyone benefited or whether he was simply making the occupying system less efficient. There were no messages sent back to him. No thanks, no acknowledgement. But John no longer needed proof. He understood something fundamental. A network does not require a central coordinator. It exists because points in the system react to one another. And John was one point, small, overlooked, but positioned where his reactions propagated further than usual. One morning, Jan's ledger was taken earlier than usual. A different clerk collected it, not the familiar one. Jan did not ask questions. He did not show concern. But he understood that attention, however indirect, had begun. He slowed down. Not stopping, never stopping, just less. Jan understood that an invisible network had to breathe. It could not apply constant pressure. It had to allow the system moments of calm. For several days, his records were flawless. Exact arrivals, exact departures, no deviations at all. Everything looked perfect. And then, when the system began to relax, Jan introduced a deviation so small it barely mattered. Barely. Enough to remind the system that stability was not guaranteed. Jan did not know how far he would go. He had no long-term plan. He did not imagine an end. He only knew that he was doing the only thing available to him, not with force, not with slogans, but by forcing a system larger than himself to keep adjusting. And in wartime, constant adjustment is a weakness. The occupation demanded certainty, predictability, timetables that could be trusted. Jan offered none of that. He offered plausibility. The system could explain any single deviation. It could not explain all of them together. And as long as it tried, it would never quite rest. That, Jan realized, was enough. Suspicion did not arrive as an accusation. It arrived as adjustments. So small that anyone not living inside the system every day would have missed them. Jan Kowalczyk noticed it on an otherwise quiet morning. There were no new officers, no direct questions. No one said his name. But the clock on the station wall had been replaced. The old clock, faded, slightly uneven, familiar down to the way the minute hand hesitated, was gone. In its place hung a newer one, brighter, mounted slightly higher. Its position was no longer perfectly aligned with Jan's natural line of sight from behind the wooden counter. Jan said nothing. He simply noted it. In systems like this, small changes often meant attention was shifting. A few days later, an officer stood on the platform longer than usual while Jan worked. He did not look at Jan. He looked at the clock, then at the train. No words were exchanged, no eye contact made. But the presence itself was enough to signal that the margin of safety was not fixed. It shrank when someone stepped closer. Jan began to wonder whether his deviations had crossed a threshold, or whether they had merely made someone uneasy. The system rarely acted against individuals. It acted when it sensed loss of control. And loss of control did not require proof. It required discomfort. Jan adjusted immediately. He eliminated anything that could be predicted. No more changes on sensitive routes. No more deviations at similar times of day. No repeated patterns that could be traced backward. For days, his ledger was immaculate. Arrival times matched perfectly. Departure times aligned exactly. Not a single minute out of place. He returned to his old role, the invisible clerk. Dull, reliable, unremarkable. Someone not worth watching. But the tension did not vanish. It simply moved inward. Each time Jan picked up his pen, he wondered if this would be the last day behind the wooden counter. Each time footsteps sounded behind him, he asked himself whether someone was observing how long he looked at the clock. Jan understood that the greatest danger was not being caught in the act. It was being labeled unreliable. An unreliable man did not need to be accused. He could be replaced quietly, no explanation required. And replacement meant the end. No heroes, no dramatic confrontation, just a name removed from a schedule. Jan adopted a new principle: never become the center of attention, positive or negative. He allowed others to make mistakes. He let the system generate its own noise. He intervened only when he was certain his actions would dissolve into the background. One afternoon, Jan was summoned to a regional office. Not for interrogation, not for questioning, just a procedural confirmation. The room was small, a wooden desk, one officer. Jan's ledger lay between them. No accusations were made, no criticism offered. The officer asked only neutral questions. How long had Jan held the position? Did he encounter any difficulties? Was the station clock easy to read? Jan answered briefly, calmly, without defensiveness, without detail. The meeting ended quickly. As Jan left, he understood that this was not a warning, it was a measurement. The system was assessing whether he reacted like an innocent man or like someone hiding something. In moments like these, truth mattered less than appearance. Jan passed, but the boundary had been tested. From then on, every deviation had to justify its risk. Each time he lifted his pen, he weighed consequences. Jan no longer thought of his actions as isolated moments. He thought of them as existing within a limited window. He did not know how long that window would last, only that it would close, either through reassignment or through the end of the war. Until then, his task was simple: remain ordinary, remain forgettable, and intervene only when the system could no longer distinguish intention from randomness. The line had been approached, but Jan was still standing on this side of it. There was no specific day when Jan Kowalczyk decided to stop. No clear ending, no final act, no line in the ledger marked "last time." Things simply began to feel different. High-priority trains appeared less frequently. Schedules still shifted, but the tension they once carried had softened. Officers argued less. The system, in its own way, had learned how to live with instability. Or perhaps it had simply found other causes to blame. John still stood behind the wooden counter every morning. He still opened the ledger, still looked up at the clock. But he made fewer adjustments now, not out of fear, but because they were no longer necessary. The web of small deviations he had helped create had spread far enough. It no longer depended on him. Elsewhere, other people were adjusting, guessing, reacting to imperfect data, and each reaction created new distortions of its own. John never learned what happened beyond his station. He never knew whether delayed trains influenced larger decisions, or whether his quiet changes saved anyone, or merely made the occupying system slightly less efficient. No reports ever came back to him. No thanks, no medals. One morning, Jan's old ledger was replaced with a new one. Cleaner cover, whiter pages, sharper lines. The first page held nothing special. No note, no signature, just a fresh start for numbers. Jan wrote the first entry in his familiar hand. Ink soaked into paper. Time was recorded. Life continued. War, like all wars, does not end at a single moment for those far from the front lines. It withdraws gradually. Symbols disappear first. Uniforms change later. Orders lose their sharp edge. And then one day, the station no longer belonged to those who once occupied it. No one came to ask John what he had done during those years. No one reopened the old ledgers looking for patterns. The numbers, if they had ever mattered, had dissolved into millions of others. They became anonymous history. John worked for a short while after the war. Then he retired. The wooden counter was replaced. The wall clock was changed once more. Life, as it often does, erased the details it no longer needed. If someone were to examine Lublin's railway records from those years, they would find nothing remarkable. Just arrival times, departure times, minor adjustments, delays without explanation. There would be no line stating that a man stood there every day, weighing numbers as if they were lives. No line noting that sometimes resistance does not look like weapons, but like deliberate imperfection. John Kowalczyk left no memoir. He did not tell his story to his children as a tale of heroism. Perhaps he did not see it that way himself. He only knew that for a period of time, when the world around him was governed by large commands, he found a very small gap, just enough to keep a machine from running perfectly. And sometimes, in war, that is all an ordinary person can do. What John did was never recorded in history books. His name appears on no list of honors. There is no anniversary. But every system has points it cannot fully control. And history is often changed not only by actions that are remembered, but by countless small, silent acts that no one ever wrote down. Most wars are remembered for their battles, but many are shaped by people who never carried a weapon. By those who worked ordinary jobs, made small decisions, and quietly refused to let a system run perfectly. If you want to continue exploring these silent stories, the unseen resistance hidden inside everyday life, subscribe to the channel. Not to glorify war, but to remember that history is shaped not only by heroes, but by ordinary people who chose not to obey perfectly.